Okay, so we had three breakout room inquiries on the table. The first one being, what did you think you knew about Malcolm X prior to watching the interviews? And then what did you learn about Malcolm after watching the interviews? The second one being, what distinctions can you draw from Malcolm within the Nation of Islam in the first video, and then Malcolm outside of the Nation of Islam in the second video? What are the differences between his conversation, his disposition, and his thoughts? And then finally, what stood out to you most about watching the interviews? Who would like to share what was discussed in their breakout rooms?
Professor?
Yes, sir.
Before I start, remember you said last class we're going to do code switching?
Yes, thank you, Santiago. Yes. Thank you, sir. So why don't you start us off, Santiago? What was your experience with the code switching?
Okay, it's because I didn't know. I'm not sure if I'm the only one, but I didn't know we had to do the Malcolm X. That's why I'm not sure if I'm the only one who
Okay.
is a little behind. But let me. I have it right. I have it right here. Okay. Code switching can benefit the speaker whenever they want to have a better understanding of the topic. I usually code switch whenever I'm doing homework and I'm helping somebody who doesn't understand Spanglish or English. If I switch to one language or to another, the person that I'm helping is going to understand me better. And I also give me 1 second. Somebody's knocking on my door. Sorry about that.
Yeah, go ahead. Jake, I think you had unmuted yourself. Did you want to kind of speak to the code switch assignment, or was it to the actual Malcolm X discussion?
It was I more or less a question. I had a question on. So did we have to do a journal on the code switching assignment for last week, or was it the Malcolm X interviews?
I asked for both.
Both. Okay.
Yeah, I asked for you to do
Gotcha.
like the code switch, like which called like the practice of not code switching and then write about it, but then the reading for the week was the Malcolm X.
Max, gotcha. Okay, thank you.
I must not have been clear about that. Tanaya?
I wanted to comment on, I wasn't able to engage on in the conversation between my peers because I was getting off of work, my first shift of the day. But something Muhammad and Yerusemi, I believe that's her name. I'm sorry if I mispronounce it. They engaged in a really insightful conversation about Malcolm X, because on one side, not trying to, divide, but for Yerusemi, it was more so, she was looking at it at the point of view of what Malcolm X was saying. Like, she perceived it in a negative manner.
Okay.
There was a particular part of the conversation where she was talking about how, in a sense, Malcolm X was for like Black supremacy as Trump is for white supremacy.
Okay.
And, I had to sit back and like think about it for a second. I was like, I wonder how many people perceive it that way, perceive like when Black people are speaking of, maintaining Black relationships and not seeking friendships outside of, your race. I wonder if that's how it's perceived by many people when they look and they rewatch certain interviews. And then Muhammad, he was like, you have to get a full scope. You can't just see this particular interview or read this particular article and perceive someone as a supremacist, when in actuality, you have to look at both sides. You have to look at the situation at hand. You have to look at what's going on. So I just found that like really intriguing, how different people view Black movements and, intellectuals within Black movements. Like that was just really intriguing for me.
Yerusemi or Muhammad, did you want to kind of comment to that? Go ahead, Yerusemi.
Well, I just based it on what Muhammad was saying in couple of, Malcolm X was saying in couple statements that he said on the first interview. which is one was when he say an eye for an eye, which is the retaliation that it's they used that many years ago. Like if somebody kills your brother or if somebody slaps your face, you slap them back, which is that's violent. You know, that's how I see it.
Okay, so let me ask you, Irasimi, what about the person who slapped him first? Right, so if the idea is an eye for an eye, that means somebody already took out your eye, right? So for you to respond in kind, oh shit, am I freezing?
You froze for a little bit.
Yeah, but I can hear you now.
Okay, cool. So and this is why, and this is not to pick on you, Irasimi, because this is part of my larger conversation around this idea of violence, right? Oftentimes when we get in conversations around things like violence, it's tied and it's related to power, okay? So we don't question the police when they brutalize and they murder and they beat people in the streets, but it's a issue when people respond by rebelling and then property gets damaged because that's violent. It's an issue when it's not a problem when Oakland police could go through and run rampant on the Black community, but then it becomes problematic when a group of people inside of Oakland decide to arm themselves and then patrol the police to make sure that they do not, in fact, brutalize their community, right? So, and again, this is not to single out you, but this is a larger conversation as we as a society understand these concepts and these ideas of violence. Because again, violence is what built this country. Violence is what allows us to experience some of the luxuries and the safeties that we experience and are able to obtain. But I question, why is violence irrational, irresponsible, and unnecessary when it comes to defending oneself? Because to have an eye for an eye, that first eye has to be taken out.
I don't know. It just I don't think like the message was killing. Like he say another one. He says, "Kill the dog if the dog bites you."
Killed a two-legged dog that stuck the one-legged dog on you. So Irasimi, you have children?
Yes.
What would you do if someone tried to harm your children?
I would defend him, but not killing. Not killing.
Okay, so that's where you would draw the line with killing.
Yes.
So let me ask you this. If a dog is attacking your child and you're trying to defend the dog and the dog ends up dead, do you feel that you're at fault for that?
Can you repeat it one more time?
So if your child is being attacked by the two-legged dog, so to speak, and you're defending your child from the dog's attack and the dog ends up dead, will you find yourself at fault for that?
If I kill the dog, yeah.
You would find it so. Okay.
But I don't think I will be able to kill two dogs or kill one dog.
Okay, so but what he's saying, no, so what he's saying is kill the dog itself, right? Kill the actual dog that's attacking your child or you, but then he's saying the two-legged dog is the person who stuck the dog on you, right? So that he's talking about the individual, the police, the sheriff, or whoever who's sticking the dog on the person. You see what I'm saying?
Not really. I will have to do more research about.
Okay, so he's being metaphorical. It's a metaphor, right? So he's not talking about killing two dogs. He's killing about the actual canine that's attacking you, right? And then the police officer or the sheriff that sent the dog to attack you, he's calling a two-legged dog. Does that make a little more sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's what he's saying. But again, this is just to get you all to question this idea of violence, which is really self-defense. because it's not violence, it's self-defense once violence has been enacted upon you. I'm gonna go to Zion first, and then we'll work back to Tanaya because I haven't heard from Zion yet.
Hi, I just had like a question. So we're basically saying like we're just gonna we're advocating for violence in a way.
No, it's one, it's not we, right? Like everyone was entitled to have their own position. I think Irasimi is saying that she doesn't advocate for violence. Like that's not what she feels comfortable with, or I guess what she doesn't feel comfortable with is murder, right? She said, I would draw the line at killing. So I don't think what I'm saying is indicative of everyone's thoughts, but I'm just proposing a counter argument, if you will, for how we think about this word violence. But go ahead.
Okay. No, I was just wondering,
Okay.
but you explained it in a way like advocating for what violence means, but I just want to listen further.
Okay. Yeah. So, and again, it's to question what does violence mean? And then also to draw a distinction between violence and self-defense, right? Tanaya?
I am also having the same conversation, a conversation around violence in my other Pan-African Studies course based around psychology. And it's really interesting to see like the different interpretations of violence just in day to day. Just it's kind of like, what is it called? It's pro-social and anti-social. That's what the heading is for the chapter in our Pan-African Studies psychology course, but it's still like all goes under the same thing. It's kind of like, you know, with the saying an eye for an eye for an turn away. Like when you're taught, like, I don't know if this is taught in other minorities or racial groups, but in Black households, sometimes you get told like, you know, you don't always have to react. You don't always have to feed into what somebody's doing. But the older I get and the more I think about it, it's like, you know, sometimes I'm just like, no, like, why should I let it slide? Be it based off what somebody else may perceive of me? Because at the end of the day, why is it fair? Why is it fair game for somebody to sit here and antagonize me or put their hands on me? But when I retaliate, now I'm the one in the wrong. And, you know, I know it's against a lot of belief systems, religion. Like I believe in God, and I know that I don't know if everyone believes in God. I do want to say that, but I believe in God. And I know that he doesn't want me to retaliate. But I also know that there are certain circumstances, even in the Bible, where it does talk about, like, you know, you can't just do things onto others and then expect good things to come onto you.
So just real quick, Tanaya, on that point, like, just to be real, the God in the Bible is violent as fuck. Just saying, but go ahead.
Yeah. And it's, you know, violence is everywhere. I feel like violence is perceived like given this negative connotation, but it's one of those things that realistically you can't escape. A lot of things, I think violent is like the wrong word for it, honestly. I don't know a better word yet, and I would just have to do more research. But in all actuality, every person, every being, every creature on this earth has a limit. If you see animals that are tested, if you put animals in a situation or an environment that agitates them, at some point, they will react to the situation that you have put them in that makes them uncomfortable. So same thing as like if you go in a restaurant. Now, one person may be able to compose themselves, but there's this expectation that if I go in a restaurant and my waiter or my server is being rude to me and talking crazy to me, then I'm supposed to keep my composure, that I'm supposed to, you know, talk to them nicely and still give a tip and still, you know, still be personable. But I feel like if we have an expectation of the person who has something being done against them to keep it together, then we should also, like, we should go harder on the person who's agitating them. It's not fair to just, like, it's almost like, forget that this person hit you, but why did you hit them back? That's what it seems like to me. And it's not that I'm pro-violent. I'm not a violent person, but I do know everyone has their limits. So if you're constantly picking and picking and picking at somebody, at some point they're gonna react. And you can't just be mad at their reaction when you know that you've constantly picked at that person. It's just not fair. It's not fair to them, and it's not realistic to only be upset at them, but not at the person who's constantly, bringing them frustration or agitation. It's not fair. It's just not fair to them.
Yeah. Mohammed?
So yeah, wanted to ask Tanya a question that at what point does an individual find it okay to react? Because everybody has different pressure points and different situations. So someone might get affected by a simple thing, or someone might, so you guys get my point. So that is very important. So regarding, I think Erasimi, as I was talking with her, I think she was having a general tone. Like it's always, I mean, you can't always go like, action, reactions. There are also some situations where it could be done much more in a different way, in a different approach, where you understand someone's perspective, and then you could get some. But I mean, I'm not saying that this can be applied to all the situations, of course, because but she was trying, I think what she was trying to do is she was trying to get a balanced approach towards understanding each other's perspective and figuring out a way to coexist.
Yeah.
This is what I got from her. So yeah, just wanted to
A context, to provide a context of the discussion. Yeah. And I think that's important, Mohammed, right? And with that being said, there's a historical and a social context to what Malcolm is talking about, right? So let's just say 1964 to 1965, we'll give it that year, right? I'm not a mathematician, but we'll just even be generous, right? I'm being generous, and we'll say 1619, right? As when this project of Americanism comes into play, right? Just being generous, right? So again, I'm not a mathematician, but somebody, what's the numbers on 1619 to 1965? How long is that, right? For one group of people to experience subjugation at the hand of another group of people. So if we are to put that into like a real context, and we are to use this example of an eye for an eye, it's really not an eye for an eye, right? Like we done lost 2 eyes, both ears, all of our lips, our hands, our nose, our arms, our legs, right? At this stage in the game, right? So I'm kind of agreeing with Tanaya in the sense that violence isn't even appropriate for what Malcolm is talking about. At bare minimum, it's a form of self-defense. And one thing about power, if you study power, like if you really study and read and research how power operates, the only thing that moves power is power. That's physics also, right? So this is kind of like what we're dealing with. Go ahead, Erasimi, and then Zion.
I just want to ask you, what is the difference between Malcolm X movement and Martin Luther King's movement? Because what I understand that he wasn't really a fan of Martin Luther King.
And then so also, Erasimi, I want to draw this very clear like reality. And this is part of the question number 2, right? So the first video that you watched, Malcolm X is within an organization called the Nation of Islam. And if you pay close attention, he doesn't respond for himself. He says, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad teaches, and then he'll start speaking, right? So a lot of where he's thinking is from his ideological training within the Nation of Islam. In the second video, he's removed from that organization. So a lot of what he's thinking is really of his own thoughts and his own volition. But to answer your question, right? Martin Luther King was largely a non-violent civil rights movement, okay? Part of their objectives were to integrate American society, and I'm gonna try to make this distinction without being long-winded. So civil rights, right? Where can you eat? Where can you work? Where can you live, right? These are components of your civil rights, your ability to be a civilian within a society, right? So this is kind of like what Martin Luther King and his group was up to, right? Before Malcolm X died, before he was assassinated, his objective was to bring the United States to the United Nations for human rights violations, right? And human rights is your simple capacity and ability to live, right? So the Black Lives Matter movement started because police were murdering Black people, right? So they were impeding on their ability to just live. So that is a human rights issue. So Malcolm was a human rights movement that sought to use any means to ratify this disparity, right? So it could be violence, it could be nonviolence, it could be whatever. Nothing is off the table for us to end the system of oppression that we're under. So that's how I would draw those distinctions. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Zion?
Well, yeah, honestly, we probably just have to go further into the discussion, but I was just gonna mention or say that, like, I just don't, I'm not understanding at the end of the day, like what you're saying with the violence, because I don't know, I just feel like it's low hanging fruit at the end of the day, and it's just like a form of insecurity. And I just feel like there's always a different way that you can react than becoming like physical or doing certain things. There's just always a different way. And I only say that because like I've dealt with really serious issues, like with people being sent to jail, and like, I don't know. But at the end of the day, I don't think anybody should, like, it's not our judgment, or it's like to say somebody should die or we should react that way. Like, it's up to God at the end of the day. Like, we should, our reaction is our own.
So again, like let's put into context, right? Like historical context is very important to understanding, one, the conversation that we're attempting to have, right? Two, keep in mind the dynamics of the conversation, right? How does violence even come into the conversation as it pertains to what Malcolm is talking about? Does anybody know? How does that even get brought up? Who brings up the question of violence? The interviewer, right? So Malcolm doesn't mention violence. They ask him about violence, right? So that's one is important. Two, think about what a lot of people said in the sense that I didn't really know about Malcolm, and what I knew about Malcolm was just that he was this violent person, right? Three, has Malcolm ever done any act of violence? Never. It's not been in the interview. They talk about this. In fact, one of the in the first interview, they ask him, well, if you think that the Nation of Islam should be able to defend your community, why haven't they done more to defend your community, right? So one, be attentive to the fact that they're using this term violence to delegitimize the work of Malcolm X, right? So Zion, are you with me on that? Does this make sense?
Yeah, I'm listening.
Okay. So that's one of the contexts, right? So then now let's take in a historical position, right? Like from history standpoint, from a vantage point of history. Again, this is one group of people. Have you ever been in like a physical fight, Zion?
Yeah.
Okay, so you know the dynamics of that, right? So this is a people who has been in a fight for over 500 years, right? And this people has tried to do it non-violently. They've tried it, right? They tried to appeal to the people, to the aggressor's consciousness, right? They tried to appeal to the aggressor's laws, right? They even said, well, you know what? We won't strike back. We'll allow the aggressor to pulverize us to a point that they'll feel bad for beating us and they'll stop, right? This is the intentions behind the nonviolent tactic. You with me?
Yes, I'm
Okay.
listening.
So these questions are now being posed as to what should Black folks do now? And to which Malcolm responds is, the only way to respond to violence is to meet it in kind. Just like when you were in that fight, you had no choice but to swing back. You could have walked away or you could have continued to got your ass whooped. So Malcolm is posing a theoretical option. Because again, on record, I see you, Brandon, he's never engaged in any violence. The Nation of Islam has never on paper engaged in any violence, right? So these are all theoretical ideas about how to address a community being constantly assaulted, right? And so when asked the question, and his ideology and platform is, we'll take any means necessary to liberate ourselves, we cannot leave this idea of violence off the table. Last thing I'll say, Zion, if you want to dig a little bit deeper, I would recommend this book. It's called The Wretched of the Earth. It's by Frantz Fanon. And the whole first chapter is 65 pages dealing with the questions of violence in a colonial situation. And that will give you some really profound insight to how the colonized process this idea of violence. Brandon?
Sorry. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think a lot of what we're talking about, like violence and stuff like that, I think that also plays into the thought processes or what we're taught about him from years ago. So a lot of people are focusing on the violence aspect of it instead of actually listening to what he was saying, because yeah, it does sound like he's advocating for, I guess you can say, violence, but in every word that I've heard him talk about, it's been about self-defense as a people. So I think if we kind of get out from what we were taught about him, I think that was one of our questions, right? What did you know about him before these these interviews? I think if we can break out of what we thought about him and kind of place ourselves in, okay, let's learn something new about him, we'll kind of understand what exactly he's talking about.
It's a very good point, Brandon. Thank you. I'm going to go to Alexandra tonight, and then we'll jump to you just because we haven't heard from Alexandra. Alexandra?
Yeah, so I'm usually part of Group A, so I guess I'm new. I'm not sure what the conversation's usually like here. I guess I'm kind of just like very triggered by what I'm hearing from people right now, because I'm thinking like, if all the centuries of fighting had never happened and we just like let God happen, like where would we be today? Like, to me, to say like let it go in the hands of gods is like crazy. I'm sorry, I don't mean crazy, but it's just very baffling to me.
I'm sorry, say that one more time, the last part, Alexandra.
To let God, like, oh, it's in the hands of God. Like, if nobody ever fought back, where would we be now? And that's just very triggering to me.
So just to make sure that I'm understanding correctly, you're saying that if we are to, as a society, to take the idea that we're not going to intervene and just let God play its course, where would we be as a society? That thought is triggering to you. Is that, am I understanding correctly?
Well, yeah, we would, I mean, I'm Native American, but I mean, Black people would still be enslaved if we, like, where would we be today? So I think it's very interesting what I'm hearing from my peers.
Yeah, and so like, let's take that to a contemporary example, right? Like what's going on in Ukraine, right? And if we are to just say, God's going to intervene for the Ukrainians and hopefully that the Russians won't, right? Like, nah, that's not going to happen. You know what I'm saying? The Russians are going to continue to do what they do. And the only way that Russia will stop their invasion of Ukraine is by a force that's equal or greater than Russia to make them stop. So Alexandria, I hear you. I genuinely hear you. Tanaya?
There's a lot of different aspects of this conversation that I want to engage in, because let me go to the chat, because I really don't want to mispronounce, like with Zion. I can understand where she's coming from when you're in a lot of situations that revolve around people acting violently, that in situations where they don't necessarily need to act violently, like maybe it's just an argument that they're having and then they like lash out, I can understand not agreeing with violent actions or the discussion of violence.
Yeah.
But I also, you know, and another, because me personally, like I've experienced firsthand like very violent situations, and it's made me avoid those things because my anxiety, like the anxiety that it brings me, I'm just not comfortable with having around myself. So it made me distance myself from certain people that I know are reactive to just things that I would consider minute. But when I was referring to violence, and I really don't like using this word because we're not talking about the same thing.
Yeah.
Violence over like a boy getting into it over a boy, or a relationship like that, and then lashing out in those circumstances would be something that you consider violent. But when you have someone who goes to school and is getting antagonized, getting bullied every day, the bully is hitting them every day, the bully is antagonizing them and hurting them, and then that person lashes out and engages in a fight with the bully, you cannot sit there and just say that that student or whoever was just lashing out. It's just not the same thing. And then even, you know, with God, when you read the Bible, yes, God speaks of peace. He wants us to have peace, but the Bible also speaks of war. There are wars in the Bible. And the term violence, you know, when you use that and then you use it in the same sentence as the Bible, I know for some people it's like, whoa, you're talking against God. No, I'm not talking against God. But when you read the Bible, you see those things. There's a saying, there's nothing new under the sun. So because we're having wars now, you can infer that we have had wars in the Bible, that we have had wars in texts that predate the Bible, that are around the times of the Bible. So it's kind of like, it's just individual perceptions of violence. And then these expectations are what create societal norms in terms of reaction. That's why the action isn't taken negatively in society as much as the reaction. Like in the comments, we were talking about the Will Smith situation. Do I think, you know, Will Smith should have slapped Chris Rock? Would I slap somebody for saying something about my significant other that I felt was way out of line? I feel like that's how people should think about it, because we react because that's Will Smith. But if it was somebody on the street, if I see someone disrespect somebody's wife, and then that man goes and gets into it with the man that disrespected his wife, you're going to say, well, he should have never said nothing about that man's wife. That's what you would say, because that's a person on the street. You're not going to say, oh, he didn't need to react that way. Some people may say that, actually. But many people that are, you know, persecuting and talking down on Will Smith right now wouldn't say that if it was a person on the street. It just has everything to do with these expectations that we place on certain individuals when it comes to action reaction situations. I don't think everything should be reactive. I don't think every situation requires a reaction, but there are certain situations where after there comes a point where you just can't let things slide. You can't keep letting somebody step on your neck and then just sit there and hope that one day they lift their foot off of you. At some point, you know, you're gonna have to fight back for yourself, or this person, it can possibly hurt you really bad.
Muhammad?
Yeah, just wanted to clarify, is Tanya supporting what Will Smith did? I just didn't get the point. Like, is she trying to say that if that person was a street person and he would do the same thing, that it's justified to slap him?
No, I think what she's saying is like, the celebrity of Will Smith has made it something more than what it is. So whereas if you were just seeing somebody's talking shit about somebody's wife on the street and that person slaps them for talking shit, you would process this differently, right? But I think because of the moment and who produced the moment, it has a life of its own, right? So I think she's saying that, you know, we kind of have to kind of strip ourselves from those things and look at the incident for what it is. Tonight, am I paraphrasing you correctly?
Yes.
Okay.
And to further clarify for Muhammad, because I can understand how like that seems confusing. Quite honestly, I can't say whether or not I think that was wrong because I wasn't in that situation. I have to think about it like if that was me and I was out with my husband or with my boyfriend and a girl says something that I think is disrespectful. But then again, you would also have to think, you know, this girl is my friend because Chris Rock and Will Smith friends, or do they just work in the same industry? Because if they're not friends and that's just a person who knows the people you know, and then they say something that you think is slick, you know, I don't know how I react. I don't know if I would, you know, be upset to the point of putting hands on that person, or if I would just simply call them out and say like, hey, that's not cool. Like, don't sit there and make jokes. That's not funny, especially if I know that it means something deeper to my husband or my boyfriend. But, you know, I haven't been in that particular situation, so I can't necessarily say whether or not I think what he did was wrong.
So
Tanya, could I just say something? It's like I really understand your feelings about it, but you know, just to be like, you know, what I feel about it is like, you know, if someone is abusing you like verbally, you should have a verbal approach rather than hitting someone, because like when you hit someone, it takes it to a different level.
yeah.
So if you are like verbally, you know, reacting or defending yourself, that's gonna be a better, much more appropriate way to do it. If someone is saying like, this is what I feel, but I don't know, like probably it depends.
Yeah, I feel you, Muhammad. I do. That's kind of how I teach my kids, right? Like, if they're saying something to you, then engage back in verbal discourse. But once they put their hands on you, then it's different. But I'm looking at the chat, and I think what Brandon is mentioning is spot on, right? And he says, I think the understanding of Malcolm also deals with the difference in culture. And I think that that's profoundly astute. And it kind of gets to where I was going to go with the close of our class, right? One thing that's obvious, Malcolm is polarizing, right? Like I didn't even get to none of my notes or none of that shit. The whole form of class got thrown out the window because of how polarizing this individual was. And a large part of that polarization is due to the media machine creating this simulacrum or this symbol of what Malcolm is that vastly differs from who Malcolm is and what Malcolm talks about. Again, we spent a whole hour and 15 minutes talking about Malcolm X, but strictly through the prism of violence. And think about this. He's never engaged in a violent act. Any organization that he's been tied to never has been involved in a violent act. All he did was get Black people to think about the idea, of defending themselves. Because I think what should be taken away of anything, right, is not about violence. That's not the question. At best, is self-defense. At best, is self-defense. And this idea, if you already even take science, right? The notion of evolution and the first law of nature is to preserve oneself, right? So one can even argue it's natural to defend oneself against harm. But you see how a system of power through media, through controlling of education, right, can distract us to where our whole conversation has been dealt with violence and doesn't even deal with what Malcolm was talking about. Zion?
sorry. Just to also ask and to further the conversation, like with Martin Luther King, just thinking about everything that everything that everybody went through back then, like, and what his whole movement was based on was like the whole nonviolence. And so you see like everybody getting sprayed and getting beat and everything, but they always choose like not to fight back. And so how would you say like the Malcolm X theory, like what you're saying, how would you say that integrates, or how would you say, I don't know.
So let me make sure I understand this, Zion. So you're saying like we have an historic example of this idea of nonviolence, right? And then we have this, I guess, and correct me if I'm putting words in your mouth, like a theoretical example of Malcolm talking about violence. Like, how do you account for the success maybe of the two? Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So one, think about this. How did both of them die, Zion?
They were both assassinated.
Violently, right? So
Yeah.
one, just to think about the powers that be that these two individuals were organizing against, they don't give a fuck if you violent or non-violent. They're gonna kill your ass regardless. So one, think about that, right? But two, I also feel that a lot of what you're questioning me about, Malcolm was trying to process also. And he figures that, okay, we see the results of this nonviolent movement. It has begat more violence on the people who are trying to be nonviolent. So what other means can we take to address this, right? And then so to further kind of question your line of inquiry, what was Malcolm's objective, right? So his objective was not to bomb the United States, was not to bomb police stations, right? His objective was to take the United States to the UN for human rights violation. So even his approach was nonviolent, right? It was meta-political. So keep that in mind. But we can't really assess the success of his movement because his life was cut short. So then what you could do is look at his offsprings, if you will, and look at the Black Panther Party, right? Some argue that they're a violent movement also, but keep in mind, they're the Black Panther Party for self-defense. So there's also a self-defense movement. So you would ask, what's the success of that movement? Raise your hand or give me some kind of a confirmation if you're familiar with the free lunch program, where students in schools have access to free lunch, right? So you're familiar with that. So do you know that the free lunch program comes from the Black Panther Party, right? Because they knew that students were going hungry, were not able to function in school. So they decided, before you go to school, come to our headquarters and get lunch, right? So I think about those type of things when I think about the success of movements that Malcolm birthed, that don't take violence off the table, right? Even now, Muhammad, so depending on your school district and your income level, you could fill out some paperwork and that'll allow you access to free lunch. So Zion, that's how I would answer your question. And be honest with me. Does that answer your question? And tell me if it doesn't, and I could kind of deal with it further.
No, I completely understand. I was just, I understand Malcolm X a little bit better now. So I understand like what his motives were, or yeah.
And just, I want to say this, right? Like just real quick, because I know Muhammad got his hand up. I know we're running long on time, but I appreciate you, Zion, for two things, right? Like there's a level of vulnerability with how you handle this discourse. And Irisemi also, like it takes courage to not go along with groupthink, right? Or just to go along with what you think the professor may want you to think, right? But it's something more also. On the second point I want to compliment you on is that is intellectual work, right? Like that's how you break down theory. That, and correct me if I'm wrong, Zion, that shit was a struggle for her. And I wish I could have seen your face, because I could see you process the struggle, but I could tell you were grappling with these ideas. And as scholars, that's how we need to process information. Don't just take it for truth because somebody says it. like struggle with that shit. Try to poke holes in it to make sure if it resonates with your spirit. And to me, that's the work I can't say I've seen, but that's what I perceive that Zion went through in this discourse. Muhammad, before we run out, and we'll see how much time we have left before tonight.
Yeah, I'll just want to tell you that I think what Zion was telling was Martin Luther King being always supporting nonviolence, and where Malcolm X seems to, give that eye on eye response. I think she was saying that how can both are equally or like the same context respected by everybody and accepted by everybody, but they were having like opposing perspective on things. So for that, I just wanted to tell you that, in India, there was a British rule, and they have been ruling for 250 years, 300 years. So while there were some rebellions from Indian sides, in the British side, they were seen as terrorists, but from the Indian perspective, they were seen as national heroes. To be honest, both are correct. The British people, they see them as terrorists, but from the Indian perspective, they're national heroes. So there will be situations where both the circumstances or both the approach will be correct. So this is just what I wanted to like tell. I generally feel that there are situations where nonviolence would not be. I mean, it's not like nonviolence. It's like two ways of seeing things. There in some situations, the Malcolm X perspective would be the correct thing to do, and there will be situations where Martin Luther King perspective would be the best one.
Yeah, and before we move on tonight, real quick, just to really, the nonviolent civil rights struggle is not as nonviolent as y'all think it was. Like there was some shootouts and there were some acts of violence within the nonviolent movement. And I would suggest you read some of the work of Kwame Ture to get a deeper insight into that. Tanaya, if you can, real quick to close us out.
Actually, like Muhammad with his last statement really just put me on a whole new track of thinking. It kind of made me think about the situation a little deeper, because I do know that although we're taught how widely accepted Martin Luther King and Malcolm X were, we don't have the discussion about, who doesn't accept them and who don't agree with the things that they do. And I just think it's important for us as scholars to also, when we're looking to inform ourselves of the positive, we also have to inform ourselves of the negative perceptions and the things that may be perceived as negative that are done by, these historical figures. So, to close this conversation, I think it definitely gave us a great perspective. Like it broadened, maybe I'm speaking for myself, but I know that having this conversation broadened my perspective on, what society perceives as violence and how different cultures look at Black cultural movements and how they perceive the figureheads of our movements and what they think, we're advocating for versus what we're actually advocating for. I just think today, what it really showed me was in certain instances, there's a lot of not necessarily misinformation, but how do I want to word it? What we intend and what we are perceived as our intention are not aligned when it comes to different cultures. I believe one of my other Brandon, he had commented that earlier. So I just think that's an important takeaway for us today.
Yeah. So I think if I could put a button on that, dialectics. This is what Tanaya is talking about, the ability to view both the positive and the negative of any situation and produce theory from a dialectical standpoint. So today was a practice in dialectics. I think it was really dope, man. I don't think it's how I planned it or how I envisioned the day to be, but it's a great example of the students or the scholars taking over the educational space and making it your own. So I would prefer this than what I had envisioned anyway. Thank you all. be healthy, be wealthy, be wise. Oh, for next week, watch the Tupac videos. Please try to do it chronologically, right? So when he's in high school, the one of him in 94, and then the last one with him in the black button up, that's his, I believe that's his actual final interview. So you kind of see the evolution of thought of Tupac Shakur. So that I'll email that out, but just so you know where to go as far as next week's material. All right, y'all.